podcast made by, for, and about Beatles fans. And now, here's your host, Ethan Alexanian.
Hello. Welcome back to Fans on the Run, exploring the Beatles' societal impact one person at a time. See, I always start these shows with something really self-deprecating, but I felt today I needed something, grand to balance out my overdependence of the F word. But that's just how I roll at this point. It's been about a month since I've come back. I'm out of retirement. I've crawled out of my shell, and I'm once again thrusting episodes upon the world. That was not a great choice of word, but I digress. Again, that's a phrase you haven't heard in a while, because that's like the tagline of the show. I digress. But we have a great guest for you today. Our guest today is a professor of history at Joliet Junior College. He's the author of a fab book called Joy and Fear, The Beatles, Chicago, and the 1960s. Would you please give a warm welcome, drumroll please, there's no drumroll, but you can infer the drumroll, John Lyons, welcome to Fans on the Run.
Hello, Ethan. It's a pleasure to be here, and yes, I did hear the drum roll in my mind.
See, that's the beauty of the show. You can hear things that aren't there, but if you hear too many things that aren't there, you should probably contact a medical professional.
Exactly. There's a lot of things I hear in my mind that I probably shouldn't be telling you about. But anyway, hello, Ethan.
That's for a different podcast altogether.
Exactly, yeah. Forget about that. But it's nice to be here, and a pleasure to see you. And I'm in Chicago, and you're in Canada, I believe.
I am in Canada. Similar weather.
Yeah.
Except you're stuck with the rain today, and we get the rain.
Today
we had it yesterday.
Raining. Yeah. But up until recently, we've been under 2 feet of snow. So it's kind of nice just to see the ground.
That's something I can empathize with.
Yeah, exactly. I knew you would, us Chicago Canadians. Yes.
Us snow people.
Yeah, exactly.
So how have you been doing in this crazy time?
Well, Ethan, I've got to be honest, not too bad. I know I should tell you it's been horrible, but I always think there's 2 things. One thing is I'm alive. A lot of people aren't.
That's a good start.
Exactly. And maybe it's a low bar, but there you are. And also I'm healthy, or reasonably for my age. And the other thing is I've got a job. So for them reasons, I can't complain.
There you go.
But I'll tell you what the other thing did, the COVID did for me. It allowed me time to finish my book. Because lucky enough, I did all the research before the COVID hit. Lucky enough, I'd had everything done. I'd visited all the archives, libraries, did the interviews. And so all I had to do was finish up the writing. And of course, it was ideal that last March the 6th, I remember it well, I said to my students, goodbye, have a great spring break, and I'll see you in a week. And I haven't seen them since, except online. So anyway, I mean, in other words, I had a fair bit of time to actually finish up the book. So I was kind of glad for that as well. So I can't complain too much.
That has been one of the nice things about the COVID situation. Book delays aside, there's been a slew of great books coming out because all these good authors have time to sit down and write.
Yeah, exactly. Because I live quite a long way from my college, so it's instead of spending all that time commuting, I could spend it doing something productive. Yes. And that was one of the things productively that I did. So yeah, I've been very good. And also last summer we never went anywhere, so that was also time spent writing as well. So
you're here to talk about the book, but there's some questions I want to ask you first, kind of going back to the beginning, so to speak. How did you first discover the Beatles?
Ethan, you can probably notice, and maybe some of your listeners are educated people, I'm not from Chicago.
Wait,
I don't know. Yeah, I know. You thought I was from the South Side, but I'm not. And I'm actually from London, England. And I was born in 1960. So, a lot of people talk about them being either first generation or second generation Beatles fans. I'm kind of 1.5.
That's something I've heard quite a bit too. You were there in the 60s, but you
Yes.
weren't old enough to be one of the, kids screaming at.
I
I was
did.
going to
The only
say,
screaming I did was with my parents. It wasn't at the Beatles. And
like screaming at the JFK airport, but then I'm like, well, you're from London, so it would be screaming at the
yeah,
London Palladium or something.
yeah, or Heathrow Airport, something like that. But no, I never did any of that screaming. Except, like I say, with my parents. But no, so I was born in 1960. So basically, the Beatles were always there. I don't have a great memory of obviously first hearing them. I don't have a great memory of first seeing them. But I do remember we went to see Help, the movie. So I kind of remember that. That was what, 65? And we never had a record player in the house till the mid 60s. And my mother bought one of those Dancit box record players. Yeah.
The whole lid up for, or is it lid down for bass, lid up for treble?
Exactly, yeah, and it used to have a spindle where you could put certain singles, and the singles used to drop. I always remember that. But anyway, so we used to buy singles from about the mid '60s onwards, and one of the first I remember in the house we had was Paperback Writer. So that would have been about '66.
Do you remember any of the other singles from that time? They don't even have to be Beatles, but other singles.
I was going to say that to you because although I've got a lot of memories of the Beatles in that respects, buying the records, seeing them on TV a bit later on. It's also true that we had other records in the house. As we bought the record players, say, mid 60s, and we started to buy singles. I had an older brother and older sister as well. And so I remember having the Hollies.
Oh.
Look Through Any Window. I remember Freddie and the Dreamers. But I also remember Motown. We're a big Motown fan. So I remember the Supremes, we had their records, and Smokey Robinson. And also in England, reggae became very, very popular in the late 60s. The My Boy Lollipop was probably one of the first, the Millie record, that was earlier. Yeah. But then at the end of the decade was Desmond Decker and people like...
The Israelites.
Yeah, exactly.
The whole ska thing.
That's right, which I really liked as well. So in other words, the Beatles were just one of a number of different bands and genres of music that I liked. I can't say that I was a Beatle fanatic and, I just saw the Beatles and, everything all of a sudden turned Fab Four. It wasn't like that at all. They were just one of a number. And but I do remember
a piece of a larger puzzle.
Yeah, and I do remember them on the David Frost show. They did the Hey Jude film that you've probably seen where all the crowd gets up on stage. That was fantastic. But of course, we had a black and white TV, so it wasn't till later that I saw that in colour. But I also remember them when they appeared on the rooftop, and they had on top of the pops. They used to play Get Back. So the Beatles were always there, but like I say, I also liked other music as well. And of course, the other thing is I was a boy, and I mention this a lot in my book, and that is that it was a girl phenomena, the Beatles, in England and here. And I'd say more so in America, actually, but we could talk about that later. But what that meant was I was also interested in things like football. And so instead of having pictures of Paul McCartney up on my bedroom wall, I had pictures of, favourite football players like Colin Bell or whatever. So, in that way, I can't say that I was a fanatical Beatles fan or anything like that. And then when I started to buy my own records, which was in the early sort of 70s, 73, when I became a teenager, what I liked then was Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, David Bowie. I was a huge David Bowie fan. And then, of course, I liked punk music. I loved The Clash, The Pistols, The Buzzcocks, all of them. And I still carried on liking soul music, African-American music, disco music, and also reggae music. I've always liked reggae music. So again, the reason why I say Generation 1.5 is because we came to age, that Generation 1.5, in the 70s. And the 70s in Britain was a lot less, endearing than the 60s. There was unemployment reached Great Depression levels again. There was 3-day weeks, there was strikes. And so we kind of always felt, I think, that we kind of missed the party. The party was in the 60s and the Beatles, and we
wasn't
kind of
the summer of love anymore.
it wasn't the summer of love. It was the summer of hate in many ways. With that was the sort of slogan that a lot of the punk groups used. And of course, I was a huge Clash fan, and one of their songs, 1977, had that wonderful lyric, "No Elvis, Beatles, or the Rolling Stones" in 1977. And so that was the kind of way that they were seen as a previous generation, the Beatles and the Stones and all that, and we had our own music. So I was never, I liked them, but I was never an obsessive fan of the Beatles. And I can't understand these people that say they were 3 years old and they became huge Beatles fans. I think it's a bit too young, really.
Well, I think they could, if their parents were of the right age, hear them a lot on the radio, play the records around the house. I know someone who, his mom would play him, "She Loves You," and he'd go around the house singing like, "She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah."
That's true, yeah. I always think, though, some of them kind of look back nostalgically and trying to think that they remember being 3-year-old Beatles fans, but
trying to will it, trying to create memories.
Right. Maybe it is, because my parents were a bit older. They were Irish immigrants, and we used to play Irish music in the house rather than, "She Loves You." So anyway, that's my background in terms of...
There's an important question, because this fills a major quota for the show.
Yes.
In the 60s, did you have any records by Dave D, Dozy Beaky, Mick and Titch?
No.
I'm heartbroken.
I
have to mention that group at least once per show.
Yeah. No, I do know who they were, obviously, but no, I can't remember having records. I just remember Freddie and the Dreamers, Millie, like I say, the Hollies. I don't remember the Stones. We never had any Rolling Stones records either. No Who records. So it was kind of pop.
Yeah. The Stones and the Who may have been a little intense for a 6-year-old.
Yeah, exactly. And for my parents, I think they would have been... the Beatles were a sort of group that parents liked as well. My parents were quite happy with the Beatles. I don't think they would have been so happy with Mick Jagger or Keith Moon.
Now, would you let your daughter marry a Rolling Stone?
Exactly.
That kind of thing.
Exactly. So, yeah, and I think that was probably why. But, so top 40 pop, that's what I kind of liked. And the Beatles was just one of another that I liked.
So you mentioned the Paperback Writer single. Do you remember what your first Beatle album was?
I remember the first album that came into the house. Because, like I say, we got a record player that was playing singles first in the mid-60s. Yeah. But the first album that ever came into to the house, my brother bought, and it was Abbey Road.
So that was 69.
69. That was the first album that I saw. I was 9 years old, and I said to my brother, "What is that?" And he said, "Son, it's an album."
It's way too big to be a single.
Forget about it. But anyway, so yeah, that was the first album in the house. First album I bought, I'm ashamed to say, well, no, I shouldn't say I'm not ashamed, but for some reason it's a strange album. I don't know if you ever even heard of the group Lindisfarne.
Lindisfarne?
Lindisfarne. Yeah, it's a place in the north of England. But anyway, that was the name of the group, and the name of the album was Fog on the Tyne. They had a hit single in England called "Meet Me on the Corner."
I've heard of the single.
I don't think you have, Ethan. You're just trying to be
I've heard the name.
No, you haven't. So let's move on, because you obviously got no sympathy. So anyway, so that was the first album I think I bought, and then after that it was, everything. But in terms of Beatles albums, my brother was the one that was buying them, so I used to hear them from him. He bought the Red and the Blue albums, of course, in '73, so I was familiar with the Beatles songs. And then he also bought the early Lennon and McCartney solo records, but not the Ringo or Harrison ones.
Well, the Harrison one would have been, a little expensive because it was a triple record.
I've never asked him. I probably should. Why did you not buy the Ringo and the Harrison ones? Because he bought all the solo Lennon ones. And I'll tell you, I did quite like Sometime in New York City. I know everybody hates that record, but I kind of liked it. He played it. Oh, you don't? I thought everybody did.
No, it's delightfully raw.
Yeah, I like it. I thought there was some good songs. And also, maybe because of the Irish background, I like the songs that he sang about Ireland. And also, Paul McCartney's Give Ireland Back to the Irish. I remember that as well. But anyway, he bought a lot of Paul McCartney and Lennon solo records and the two Beatles ones. And so that was the kind of music I heard. And of course, if you got into punk in 77 or whatever, it was just around the same time that the Hamburg tapes came out. And so I think people started to sort of like appreciate early Beatles as being sort of proto-punk.
Oh, they were.
Yeah. So I think that kind of tied in. And then I just became interested in the history of pop music. And as soon as you start looking into the history of pop music, obviously you got Elvis and all the rest of them. And then it's got to be the Beatles and the Stones and all that kind of stuff, you know. And there was a lot of sort of books that came out and magazines at that time that were plotting the history of the music for the first time. And also for the first time they were bringing out these 100 best singles and things like that. And I remember NME, New Musical Express, did one in, I think it was 76 if I remember right, and it was the 100 best singles of all time. And so that
Bohemian Rhapsody was one of them, I think. I think it was Bohemian Rhapsody and A Day in the Life were tied for number one on that NME chart.
I think we got different charts.
Okay. I'm sorry.
I think A Day in the Life was even a single, was it, Ethan?
I thought it was just like the 100 greatest songs of all time.
Well, they've done a few of them down the times, but this one I remember distinctly because inside the New Musical Express, it was actually a poster. And so you could take out the poster, unfurl it, and they had sort of like images of each one of the... It's really fancy, you know, it wasn't just listing songs. It was actually a little image of each one of the singles as well. And so it was very nice. And I remember then going through that and buying a lot of the singles because they recommended them as being the best. And of course, some of the Beatles songs were on there as well. So I was interested in the history of it. And also, I don't know if you remember that book that came out. I know you're a book man. The one about the... is it a pictorial history of the Beatles? I can't remember. If it was that Tony Carr and Tyler book. Came out in the mid-70s, towards late 70s. And they were both writers on the New Musical Express. And they brought out one of the first sort of like books about the history of the Beatles, really. And it was kind of like a pictorial book.
I'm not sure that one came out over here. Because
really?
There's a couple from the mid-70s that kind of ring the same bells.
Yeah, it's quite a well-known one, but I think it's called Pictorial History of them or something like that anyway. But anyway, it was a good one. Oh, so in other words, I was getting interested in the history, you know.
Is it the illustrated history?
That could be it. That sounds better, Ethan. You've obviously got better memory than me.
Well, clearly not, because I think I just messed up that NME list. It wasn't A Day in the Life, it was Whiter Shade of Pale I was thinking of.
Oh, I can't remember actually. I should know again what was number one in their list, but that was certainly high up there, as it should be. Yeah, that was definitely very high up there.
Oh, last year I was on a huge Procol Harum kick, so I was just going through trying to find everything I could about them.
Yeah, but is that head and shoulders above all their other output or not? Have I got the wrong impression of Procol Harum?
They've got some good stuff, but Whiter Shade of Pale is definitely the creme de la creme.
Up there, in it. Yeah.
So, how would you describe your status as a Beatle fan? Because from what you've told me so far about, you know, your early life, you weren't exactly like a Beatles super fan.
No, and I'm still not, to be honest, Ethan. Between me and you, I'm not interested in hearing the 8th take of Strawberry Fields. I'm not really that interested in these extended versions of the albums that have been coming out in recent years. And I don't really know what instrument was played on every single song that the Beatles produced. So I'm not into that kind of level of sort of detail. Really what I'm interested in, I think that the Beatles were obviously a cultural phenomenon. And so I'm more interested in the history. I consider myself an historian of the Beatles. I'm not a musicologist. I really, you know, I couldn't really write on particular songs, but I'm more interested in them where they fit into the 60s and the history of Britain, America and the world. But I mean, obviously I still like the Beatles, but as you know, I'm sure most people do, but I can't pretend that I'm a fanatic. You know, I'm not interested in going to see tribute bands or
Yeah.
that sort of stuff, really.
Well, you do seem to have a niche. I follow you on Instagram, and you post all these wonderful magazines of interviews. Would
Yeah,
that be your niche?
Yeah, I'll tell you how that come about, Ethan, is that when you write a book like this, you do so much research, okay? And once it comes to write the book, you realise that you can't use it. It's just not going to fit the story that you're using in the book. And also the editor has a red pen, and they also put lines through pages. So in other words, I had a lot left over, and I was always wondering, what am I going to do? Should I write more articles, different on Facebook and on Twitter?
So, how did you decide to write the book? Did you approach it from like a Beatle historian perspective, or from just a regular historian's perspective?
Yeah, the book came about because my last book was actually, it was called America in the British Imagination. And as it says on the tin, it was basically about the British view of America since World War II. And as I was finishing that, I thought I wouldn't mind doing a book that kind of looked the reverse way, in other words, looking at the American view of Britain. And as I was thinking about that, I began to realise that it'd be a better book or a more manageable book if it was just about the Beatles, because obviously the Beatles do change the American view of Britain. And so I thought I'd write a book, therefore, about the American view of the Beatles when they came here in the 60s, obviously. And so as I started with that idea, I realised that America is just too big a place and too regionalised to do a generic, what did the Americans think of the Beatles? Because in the 1960s, even more than now, but I know it's very similar now, America is such a regional place, that you have your own, obviously, histories, ethnic makeups, racial makeups, their own TV stations, their own radio stations, their own politics, their own newspapers, their own music scenes. Some groups are very popular in some part of the country and never heard of in other parts. And so it just made more sense for me to actually pick a region and go into greater detail about how exactly the Beatles impacted radio, music, newspapers, how they were seen by the media, etc., etc. So anyway, so I ended up obviously picking Chicago, and that's why the book is about Chicago. And the reason why it's about Chicago is I thought I wanted to pick a city that was relatively big, and Chicago in the 60s was the second largest city in America, and it had a large black population. I wanted to understand about how African Americans viewed the Beatles. It has a large student population, so I wanted to view how students saw the Beatles, and also suburbs. They had a growing suburbs in the 60s. So it seemed to fit as a place that was kind of like a laboratory, where I had all the sort of demographics that I needed to do a thorough research on how people in Chicago viewed the Beatles. But I should say one other thing, and that is when I think it's true about anybody writing these sort of community studies. You don't just draw a circle around Chicago and just say, oh, I'm just going to look at what happened in Chicago. The point is that what you do is you look at Chicago in depth, and then what you do is you compare it to what happens elsewhere. And so the book has got a lot of comparisons from what was happening elsewhere in America, and also comparing to what was happening in Britain, in the UK. And so it's not just about Chicago. It's basically about how the Beatles were seen in the Chicago area, and then how that corresponded as being similar or different to how it was seen in America, the UK, etc. And as you also know, probably Chicago has a lot of connections with the Beatles.
Well, that was going to be one of the next things I ask you. It's when people think of the Beatles in America, they usually think of, the Beatles in New York or the Beatles in Los Angeles. But seemingly Chicago is one of the strongest connections to the Beatles.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I'll just give you a few examples, but because there is literally tons. But again, the first single and first album that was released, a Beatles album single that was released in the US, was released by a Chicago-based record company, VJ. Then, as far as we know, documented evidence seems to support that the first radio station to play the Beatles in America was WLS, which was based in Chicago. And also, I think that the WLS had a huge signal. They could be heard all over America and into Canada. So I also think that when the Beatles did break in America, WS was pretty crucial for that, because once they started playing Beatles records, they could then basically be heard all over the Midwest, down into the southern states, and then up into Canada as well. Another connection is that, the Beatles toured America on 3 occasions, 3 summer tours, and they played in Chicago on each one of the tours, and they played overall 5 concerts in Chicago. And the only place that played more was New York. They played more concerts in New York, but nowhere else did they play more than 5 in the US. And then in 65, they played at White Sox Park. They played 2 concerts, and the combined audience was 62,000 people. And that's more people saw them on that day, that was August the 20th, 1965, than they did on any other stop on their North American tours.
More than Shea Stadium.
Exactly. Shea Stadium, we think 56. And Chicago 62. A matter of fact, I think, and again, it's very difficult to get figures because they didn't keep very good receipts on that at the time. So you're kind of depending on newspapers for these figures. But the only place I think where more people saw them on one day is when they played in the Philippines. Now, again, I'm not certain about that because I haven't researched it, but I believe that they played 2 concerts in a football stadium in the Philippines to 80,000. But I'm not sure. I could be wrong. But besides that, I can't think of any other place where more than 62,000 people saw the Beatles in one day. And then if you want me to go on, and I can see by the look on your face you do, they also, probably the most famous press conference ever gave was the one that they gave in Chicago in August 1966. And that was the one where John Lennon had to apologize for saying that the Beatles were bigger than or more popular than Jesus.
This would be the part in the show where I would break into my John Lennon impression and do the quote, but I'm not sure I'm going to today.
Yeah, I'd recommend no, Ethan.
You heard it here.
Anyway, so that's another one. And then, of course, even after the Beatles split up, there was a lot of connections with Chicago. I'll just give you a couple of examples. John and Yoko made some, shall we say, unusual films, avant-garde,
that would be a good
experimental. You got any other words? Anyway, and the first time that they were shown in public was in Chicago. They played here in November 68. You also, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but also they brought out an album where they were naked on the cover.
Yes. 2 virgins.
That's it. And the first place where people got prosecuted because of that album was in Chicago. 2 people that ran a store in Chicago, they put a picture up on their window display of that cover, and they were arrested by the police in Chicago. But anyway, there's tons of other, I mean, I'm only giving you little ones here, but there's tons of other connections. You know, the WLS, as far as I know, was the only radio station to ban not 1 Beatles record, but 2. And they went even further because they also banned the Cold Turkey, you know, the Plastic Ono band single. So really, you could say at the end of the 60s, they'd actually banned 3 Beatles records. I can go on and on. Well, let me give you one.
Okay. I'll
Ringo
give you
Starr.
one more.
Ringo Starr. We all see, you know, every year now on his birthday, we see him celebrating the peace and love on his birthday. Now, the first time he did that was in 2008 in Chicago. So Chicago gave birth to his yearly birthday peace and love events.
So does that mean we have Chicago to blame?
That is a word that some people use, Ethan.
That is one of the words.
Perspective of these events. But yeah, the first one he did was in Chicago. So it gives you an idea. Anyway, there's tons more. There's loads in the book. You can read it all in there. You don't need me telling you.
Well, I recommend everyone out there, go read his book. It's good.
Yeah, I think every home should have a copy.
Every home should have every home should have more than 1 copy.
Well, you're right. I didn't want to be too sort of boastful, but you're right.
Yeah, I'll be boastful for you.
Thank you, Ethan.
Something I wanted to ask you a little bit more in depth was about WLS, because a lot of people who I've talked to on my show who grew up in the Midwest and Chicago have always consistently talked about how important WLS was in getting them into the Beatles.
Yeah, I mean, in terms, okay, so basically, VJ released their first single in America, "Please Please Me," and they were based in pretty much in downtown Chicago, on the sort of south side of Chicago, and they weren't that far from where the WLS station was, and they also had connections because one of the owners of Vivian Carter was one of the owners of VJ, and she was a DJ, not a WLS, but I mean she was a DJ, so they had a lot of connections in the music business. So therefore, it was quite easy for VJ to literally walk that record from their headquarters in South Michigan Avenue up to the WLS headquarters and hand over the record. And the person that we think played it was Dick Biondi, who was the DJ in Chicago. And the reason why we know it is because they used to have these surveys where they would list the records that they played, and you can quite clearly see on a couple of their surveys that they did actually play it, and it did become a local hit in Chicago. So we do, that the only thing I say I'm a little bit hesitant to say for definite is because there is some people say that they heard "Love Me Do" played on radio stations as an import. Mm-hmm. And that may be true, I don't know. But in terms of "Please Please Me," VJ was the first to release that record, and it was played on WLS. And like I say, WLS, it was founded by Sears, and it stands for World's Largest Store. Okay?
World's Largest Store.
Yeah, that was the WLS. But the reason why it was so, why you're asking about it, is because of this huge signal that they had that meant that they could be heard all over America and into Canada. And because of that, they were nicknamed World's Loudest Station.
I actually had no idea what it stood for. I thought they were just random call letters.
I know, isn't it?
It makes sense,
World's
though.
Largest Store. Yeah, Sears, Roebuck.
Well, because you also have WGN, World's Greatest Newspaper.
Exactly. Yeah, the Tribune wasn't shy about boasting.
No.
World's greatest newspaper? I'm not even too sure about that.
One of the things that really, as an 18-year-old, kind of made my eyebrow raise in the book.
Oh, no.
You were talking about the infamous woman with the Plaster Casters, and how her career was kind of rooted in early Beatlemania.
Okay, Ethan, I knew you were going to go there. Now, a lot of people were inspired by the Beatles artistically, and the Plaster Casters of Chicago were inspired by a photo or photos that they saw of the Beatles. And what they saw is that the Beatles used to have the long hair, pretty obviously, but they also wore tight trousers. And so these teenage girls were very impressed with, the
Yes.
tight trousers. But anyway, so again, you'll have to read the book because it's a little bit X-rated, and I know that your audience can be pretty young, Ethan. But the basic gist of it is that they used to make plaster casts of men's crown jewels. And she is an artist. She did actually have exhibitions, the Plaster Casters, but the Plaster Casters of Chicago. But the funny thing is they never did any of the Beatles, you'll be delighted to hear. Or maybe you won't be, I don't know. But they were included in a Paul McCartney song.
That they were. And it was a couple years later, the inaugural Plaster Cast. Wasn't that Jimi Hendrix?
Yes, Jimi Hendrix in Chicago. And there's a lot of stories about them, about some people wanted to have complete strangers put their crown jewels into plaster, but for some reason, some people didn't. And so some people ran away when they approached them, but other people quite willingly decided that, this is a great idea to have two strangers putting my business into plaster. But anyway, that's one of the stories. I was using them as an illustration because I wanted the book to be entertaining, pretty obviously. I didn't want it to be a dry academic book. And so I wanted to include a lot of stories in the book. And that was just one of them, of people that were just enamored with the Beatles.
Well, on a bit of a lighter note, so our younger listeners, if there are any, can take their fingers out of their ears.
They've run off now, Ethan.
They have run off, and we have scared them. The book is full of a lot of really interesting quotations that you can't really find anywhere else, because a lot of Beatle books, and I'm friends with a lot of Beatle authors, I'm sorry to say a lot of them are filled with the same quotes.
Okay, now I did that on purpose. And Ethan, I am so happy you noticed that. Because what I wanted to do was I didn't want the same tired old quotes and same tired old stories. They've been done so many times. So what I wanted to do was use fresh material. So as much as possible, I tried to use material that was not commonly available. And the thing about the Beatles, they gave so many interviews. It is quite incredible how many radio interviews, TV interviews, but also print interviews they did. And it's amazing that considering all that it's the same 5 or 6 sources that people seem to use. So there's so much out there that we can get a real picture of what the Beatles thought. So anyway, I know you mentioned it earlier, and I kind of didn't answer that about the Instagram. What I'm doing on Instagram actually is I'm putting all of those print interviews on there. So if you go into my Instagram account, you can see every day I'm putting one in there, and they're all the interviews that I used for this book. But yeah, I'm glad you noticed that, because I didn't want to use the same old quotes, same old stories. I wanted to use different stories, different quotes, different sources. But you know what, Ethan? It's a lot of work.
Well, I was going to say, I don't think there's one central library with all of these quotes. You'd have to track down all these, Tiger Beat 16, whatever hyperbole name of a, bubblegum magazine or whatever. How did you go about tracking all this down?
Look, my family have suffered in me writing this book. My wife and daughter, I think, suffered the most.
My condolences.
Because every time I used to say to my daughter, should we have a day trip? And she'd say, yeah, that's great. We used to end up with me in the library and her waiting for me outside. When we went on vacations, we used to go to places like Mersfrees Borough, which is 30 miles from Nashville, so that I could find a copy of Derek Taylor's 50 Years Adrift book. Or when we used to go to England to visit relatives, I would spend time in the British Library. And we used to go to another strange place called Liverpool. And what we used to... Yeah, have you heard of it?
That sounds...
Familiar?
That sounds like...
Not Blackpool, yeah. Liverpool.
Okay, I was thinking of Blackpool, yeah.
I knew you were. But anyway, so we went there as well. And what we used to do there is I used to drag them around houses that were owned by the National Trust. I used to drag them on tours called Magical Mystery Tours of Liverpool. I used to drag them to the library, the Central Library in... So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is I basically travelled everywhere, because there's so many different sources for these books. There's a lot of good stuff in Chicago. There's Northwestern University is a good music section that has magazines there, a lot of magazines. There's also, I wanted to look at the Mayor Daily papers, which are in Chicago. But also I did have to visit places, like I say, like in Missouri, that has got the Art Unger papers. Do you remember Art Unger? He was the man. Yeah, he was the he was the owner, the publisher of Datebook magazine. The magazine that was a teen magazine that published John Lennon's Bigger Than Jesus story. Okay, and so his papers are in this state historical site in Missouri. So I had to travel there to look at them. And again, they were wonderful. letters from fans, and newspapers. He had interviews of the band that had never been published before. So so in other words, I went all over the place, and the problem with Chicago is they had 4 daily newspapers in the 60s.
Well, you had the world's greatest newspaper, and then I presume the 3 lesser newspapers.
And only one of them, the Tribune, is digitized. So that one is quite easy to sort of go through. But the others, I had to trawl through day after day, all through the 60s to try and find material. And then you have to look at the suburban newspapers. Chicago has a lot of local newspapers besides these 4 daily ones. Then, like you said, teen magazines. I had to go through the Book Monthly. I got a complete collection of them magazine, the Beatles Book Monthly magazine. And then also, because I was comparing it with elsewhere, I obviously had to then look through British newspapers. And so I was trawling also through the Daily Mirror and Daily Mail and Daily Express, which I wouldn't really recommend to anybody if you've ever read the Daily Mail or the Daily Express.
Yeah.
Anyway, I did so much research for this book, and like I say, then by the time you come to write it, a lot of it you just can't use. It's just too much.
We're talking about printed material research. What can you tell us about underground papers like The Seed?
Now The Seed was again, it's a Chicago newspaper. After the Beatles stopped touring in '66, they still had a big influence on Chicago and also the rest of America. And that was the period where they became associated with the counterculture, or if you want to call them hippies. And in Chicago, there was a countercultural scene. Now, it wasn't as big as elsewhere, but there was one. And the center of that scene was a newspaper called The Seed. And The Seed published articles about the Beatles. They also had interviews with them in there as well, and even put them on the front page. There's a couple of I don't know if you noticed them in the book, Ethan, but I put a couple of pages of the lovely pages actually of The Seed with John Lennon and George Harrison on the front cover.
I did make a note of that. I really enjoyed the psychedelic.
Very nice, very nice.
Chef's
and
kiss.
Also there was clubs in Chicago. That Kinetic Playground, which was associated with the counterculture, and they used to play Magical Mystery Tour because it wasn't shown in the US on TV. They used to show it in the club. Old Town, which again was a counterculture area, that was a place where they had all these stores that used to have Beatles calendars and Beatles pictures on the walls. So the Beatles were very much alive in Chicago even after they stopped touring, and The Seed was definitely something that communicated the Beatles as being part of this counterculture in Chicago.
Now, the book makes reference to the fact that Chicago, famously a bit of a racially divided town, but it also explores, how the Beatles kind of crossed boundaries that not a lot of other groups or artists had done before by appealing to both.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, I think it's one of these topics that hasn't been covered that much. Really, there's been coverage of how the Beatles were inspired by African American music. We know that pretty clearly.
There's the coverage of how they wouldn't play to segregated audiences.
Yeah,
but that's about it.
The Ron Howard film got a lot of criticism from Beatles experts because it was kind of. There wasn't too much new in the film, really. But they did do a good job about that, about talking to African Americans who liked the Beatles. But I wanted to develop even further. And so I wanted to look at the African American newspapers, African American radio stations, and then also talk to African Americans that were around in the 1960s. And what I found is that the Beatles were very popular on the south side and west side of Chicago, which is the areas where most African Americans lived at the time, and they were seen as being basically by a lot of people not quite American, so African Americans could relate to them in some ways because they were playing music that sounded rhythm and blues, had a very strong rhythm and blues base to it, but was also played by people who were not quite American. And so I think that was one of the reasons why a lot of African Americans were attracted to them. And also their newspaper ran a lot of coverage. The Chicago Defender was the major African-American newspaper. That also had a lot of coverage of the Beatles, and they used to run Beatles contests, and one of them was to win tickets to see A Hard Day's Night when it played in Chicago. And it's very interesting because then they showed pictures from the winners that had gone to see the film, and they showed a photograph of them coming out of the movie theater. Everybody was black. So it just showed, and also the film was shown in the South Side and the West Side. So we do know that a lot of African Americans went to see the film. And then, of course, I interviewed people that went to see them in concert. And that was very interesting as well, because there was a slight reluctance to go and see them because they knew that the audience was going to be mostly white. And they also knew that the places where they played was places where a lot of black people were scared to go. They were in the sort of white areas of Chicago. So some people did go, and I interviewed some of the people that went to see them. And and also it's true to say, like I was saying, that the owners of VJ Records, one of the woman who owned it was a DJ. And so there was a lot of coverage also in the African American radio stations. Because they were released on VJ, they obviously thought they're an African American group, and they played them on African American radio stations. So yeah, there was a lot. And then in the book, I also go on to what happens later in the 60s. And later in the 60s, the Beatles' music had changed. It did move away from that African American roots that they had, the rhythm and blue roots. And so the music appealed less to African Americans by the late 60s. But also African Americans had changed because of black nationalism. You know, the Black Panthers, and Chicago's a real center of black nationalism. And they were looking for their own cultural heroes at that time, like James Brown, Aretha Franklin, etc. And so there was a sort of movement away from the Beatles towards the end of the 60s. But certainly African Americans were caught up in Beatlemania, just like white people were.
Well, that was actually what I was going to touch on. It seemed like when I was reading this, it kind of showed a side of the Beatle popularity in the United States that I hadn't really read that much on before. It's that some of a lot of the goodwill from 64 had started to disintegrate towards the end of the 60s. You know, the radicals were not terribly happy with them. The conservative people and the government weren't happy with them. People were turning on the Beatles.
Yeah, I mean, but I think you can start to see. So I put it in the book 67 in terms of when they became more associated with the counterculture. That was something that a lot of people just did not agree with. You know, they became associated with, sort of Indian philosophy, transcendental meditation, yoga. I mean, transcendental meditation in the 60s, people didn't even know what it was, and they became associated with drugs. I think most people kind of saw that the Beatles were, involved in taking drugs. And they also became pacifists. They weren't just against the Vietnam War. They were openly pacifist. They're also anti-government. It's amazing if you read their interviews in the late 60s. And I don't mean just John Lennon. I mean Harrison and McCartney and to a lesser degree Ringo. They were all anti-authority, and that meant anti-government in many ways. And so these ideas, I think, put them out of the mainstream. They were no longer attracting that sort of young female audience that they were attracting in the early 60s, but also a lot of parents that were indulging their kids in the early 60s because the Beatles were seen as just these happy-go-lucky.
It's like, I'll take you to Woolworths and buy you a Beatle wig and we can go see A Hard Day's Night because they're cute.
Exactly.
Now you have these scary 60s, marching band people taking drugs and, playing the sitar and meditating.
That's right. And so basically those people were less enamored with the Beatles, and they certainly didn't want their kids following on what the Beatles were doing. But I would also say before 67, I think the 66 tour is also something that hasn't been looked at enough, really, because obviously we know about the Bigger Than Jesus. But the problem with that, I think, is a lot of people think that was something confined to the South, that it was a few crackpot DJs and a few crackpot newspapers that promoted this. That was all over America and into Canada, Ethan. I can see the silence in your... Yes, even Canadians were again, yes, you liberal Canadians were against John Lennon and his bigger than Jesus comment. But anyway, so yes, 66, it was all over. There was bonfires in all different parts of America, in the north as well as the south. There was boycotts of their records, much more widespread than we ever thought before by looking at local newspapers. And so therefore, when that tour took place, I don't think they sold out anywhere. Or if they did, like they said in Chicago, they did sell out. That was because the promoter gave tickets away. He was giving them away just like confetti because he couldn't sell them. And they gave them away to even charities, and the charities had problems selling the tickets. So it gives you some idea. And that was because, again, we have an image of the 60s as it being a decade of liberalism, rising liberalism, which is true. I mean, that is pretty much. But there's another story to it, and that's the rise of conservatism. And in 1966, that was the year when conservatism really came to the fore in America. That was the year where Ronald Reagan was running as governor of California. That was the year where in the midterm elections, the Republicans won in the Senate and the House. In Illinois, for the first time since about the 20s, they took over both houses. So there was a sort of, and also Mayor Daley in Chicago, he was culturally a conservative. He might have been a Democrat, but he was very culturally conservative. And there was a rise of conservatism in 66. And I think that is really why that Bigger Than Jesus was such an event, because they used it as an opportunity to basically put down the liberals. And the Beatles were a symbol of this social liberalism, even in 66. But yeah, by the late 60s, I don't think the Beatles were as popular. And people think it's a crazy idea to say, because of course their albums were still selling massively, if not more than they were before. But the Beatles' popularity was never just about their music. It was about other things, and it went beyond how many records they sold. And the amount of criticism they took in the late 60s, I think, was above anything that they saw early in the decade.
Because in the book you mentioned that towards the end of the 60s, is it the New Left or the Radical Left, or had kind of adopted the Rolling Stones as the top group?
Yes. I mean, if you, again, the counterculture started to sort of split really in 68. And especially, I think, the Democratic Convention, for those that don't know, there was basically a anti-war demonstrations in Chicago in August 68, and it ended up in a police riot. You can see there was a film that came out about it recently, Chicago 7. And a lot of the left was supportive of rock music. They thought rock music was their music. And of course, the Beatles were the foremost rock band, and they were disappointed that the Beatles never took a stand in favor of new left politics. And of course, that was exactly the same time that the Lennon song Revolution came out. And a lot of people were really disappointed in the new left with that song. And also, there is a couple of interviews you can see that Lennon does make disappointing comments, or that they consider disappointing, about the new left and about radical politics. And also, a lot of people were boycotting Chicago after the Democratic Convention because of the police riot. And of course, John and Yoko, they decided to put their film on in Chicago in November 68. That didn't go down too well. So for a number of reasons, the new left started to criticize the Beatles very heavily. You can see it in all the countercultural new left newspapers, especially in Chicago in the late 60s. And I think that was very clear. And of course, the Rolling Stones at that time were sort of like flirting with sort of, they saw the Rolling Stones as being much more like them than the Beatles. The Beatles kind of separate themselves in the new left, but the Rolling Stones kind of flirted with them. Now, if you actually look at the Rolling Stones or their music or their lifestyle or anything, they had nothing that was in any way new left. But it's because of their sort of behaviour and the way that they were personified in the media that they became the symbol for the new left, and the Beatles became a symbol of the establishment. And So yeah, I think that would be another group that turned against the Beatles in the late 60s.
You mentioned the Chicago riots at the Democratic National Convention, and I was just reading up on this the other day. The timing could not have been worse with the song Revolution, because it either came out 2 days before or 2 days after, and there's all these lyrics about, basically, looking down at violent revolution and protests.
Yeah, I mean, that song, yeah, it came out at the beginning of that week. I think it was the Monday of the convention, as the convention was starting. And, I think that song, what they really disliked about it was the part about Chairman Mao.
Yeah.
The fact that he actually said later, when Lennon was in his, quote, New Left phase in the early 70s, that he wished he never put that in. And I think that really did get a lot of the New Left disappointed, because you think of all the things that the Beatles could really have talked about politically. And I don't know if you think the same, but I think of only two songs that were overtly political that the Beatles wrote. And one was Taxman, which was against high taxes. And the other one was Revolution, which was against the New Left. And it's no coincidence. I put a lot in the book about this, and also showed you, if you saw that poster that I put in the book as well, the New Right actually adopted the Beatles as their band when the New Left dropped them.
That's not a good image change.
There you go. I'm sorry, Ethan, to leave that with you, but yes, they did. And they actually liked them because of those two songs. Who wouldn't like a band that criticises taxes and criticises the New Left? And that was basically the New Right.
I was thinking before you said them, like, which two Beatles songs are political? Piggies is borderline political.
Yeah, they're a bit more vague, aren't they? Yeah. What is the Piggies really sort of like just straight people?
Yeah. I think it's more just like George talking about, like, I don't know, the bourgeoisie or something.
Yeah, it wasn't even as clear as that. I think it was more just, quote, straight people. But anyway, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, you could make an argument other Beatles songs were political of some degree or made social comment or whatever. But they were the two most overtly political, where they even mentioned politicians, Mao and, was it Harold Wilson?
Yeah, Harold Wilson and Edward Heath, I think.
Yeah, and then Mao and the other. So, I think they're the most overtly, and they're the two that really the New Right jumped on to say, look, yeah, the Beatles are a bunch of hippies, but they're our hippies.
Yeah. Kind of going back to you, what do the Beatles mean to you?
Today?
Sure.
They mean... Okay, in terms of the way I look at the Beatles, again, I like the music, etc., but for me, it's more about their historical significance. So if I'm going to write another book, which I probably will, about the Beatles or something related to the Beatles, it's because I find them fascinating as individuals, and I find them fascinating because of the influence that they had and the way that people perceive them. In other words, you could write any book really, and or have any angle on society by looking at the Beatles. There's so much you can look at by just looking at the Beatles. What else do the Beatles mean to me today? That is what they mean to me. They're basically something that I can look at. Can I just say one thing about the individual Beatles? I also find them fascinating because you think about, other musicians or popular entertainers in the 60s and today, a lot of them don't really want to say or do anything that's going to bring unpopularity on them. And that was what was remarkable about the Beatles. They were happy to experiment, try something new, and go beyond the boundaries that society had put around them. And there wasn't many who was willing to do that. Muhammad Ali would be an obvious other one. And, there's obviously others as well, but not many. And I think that's what's fascinating about them as well. And sometimes today, when we see Paul McCartney as being the sort of like national treasure in Britain, and we see Ringo Starr flashing the V signs, peace and love, they're kind of cuddly. But in the late 60s, the Beatles were far from cuddly for a lot of people. They really felt threatened by them. And like I say, I mentioned to you earlier about the New Left, black nationalists, the the sort of people that were against the counterculture, they really felt threatened by the Beatles. They were certainly not cuddly in 1969.
Well, and I think the final questions I have for you today are my favorite, or one of my favorite parts of the show. I call these the quick fire questions. The answers are usually not very quick. What?
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Go on.
Okay. I'm sure you saw this question coming. What is your favorite Beatles song?
Okay. Now, as I've been writing this book, I've had to listen to a lot of Beatles records. Obviously, I had to listen to them all because of what I wanted to get from them. Okay. And I don't really care if I hear Yesterday, Let It Be, Strawberry Fields Again. I know I shouldn't say that to you because you want to hear them all the time.
Oh, no, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say.
Yeah, but the songs that I was drawn to were the ones that were kind of not that popular. And I'm just going to pick, can I pick one from John, Paul and George?
Absolutely.
You sure?
Yeah.
Not from Ringo.
It's my show. You can do whatever you want.
Well, that's why I had to ask you because I know it's your show.
But it's like there are no set podcast rules.
Yeah. But anyway, so I saw Paul McCartney in Chicago in 2011. And he, that night, I saw him in 2011, he sang that song The Night Before. And I love that song. And so that has stayed with me ever since that night. I think that's a great Paul McCartney song. If you want me to pick out a George song, again, this is going to be a shocker because I know most people say it isn't a good song, but I really like it. Don't Bother Me.
It's a great song.
His first one. I love that song. I think that's a great, great song. But I've heard so many people criticize it.
The backing track is delightfully clunky.
Yeah, I mean, people criticise him for the lyrics, but I kind of like it. I like everything about that song. And then the last one I'm going to pick is the Lennon one, and that's I'll Be Back. I really like that song. I think that's a great song as well. I could have picked others, but I just thought those three songs you don't hear talked about that much. But I thought that they stayed with me as I wrote this book.
You kind of mentioned in passing that there's songs that you don't want to hear. I'll ask you the flip side. What is your least favorite Beatles song? Or least favorite Beatles songs?
Okay, I was again going to pick one from each, but maybe not. I'll just say a couple that, I don't know. But anyway, maybe people do like, I can't stand Good Morning, Good Morning.
Okay. What about
Doesn't
it?
Don't know, just trite, doesn't say nothing. I find that the songs I don't like are the ones that don't say nothing or very repetitious, and I find that way. So I don't like that. I don't like I'm Only Sleeping. I found that very monotonous, over and over saying the same old thing. Okay, we get the idea. Okay, you're asleep. And then if I had to pick one more, I'd probably say Only a Northern Song.
Oh, you just hit me where it hurts, because that's one of my favorites.
I'm sorry, it doesn't do anything for me.
Different strokes for different folks.
Yeah,
it's a bit of a noisy song. There's all these sound effects fluttering, and I can see how it could be annoying.
I would say, and judging by the ones I told you I liked, and the ones I didn't like, the Beatles I like is kind of that mid-60s Beatles. The sort of Hard Day's Night, Help, Ticket to Ride, that kind of period.
Yeah.
Is the 8 Days a Week. I love that song. That sort of period.
And to round out these questions, do you have a favorite Beatle album?
Oh, it would be there for A Hard Day's Night.
That's not an unpopular answer.
Okay, you want me to be a little bit different?
Oh no,
then?
I'm just.
No, you do. I can tell by the tone in your voice, Ethan. I'm going to say Help as well. Both of them. And I do mean the British one. I know the American one was the soundtrack.
I don't care for the
British
American one.
Exactly. But both of them, I think, are pretty much my favourite. But I like Please Please Me. I like the early ones as well. I'm less drawn towards the later ones.
Well, I was saying, like, Hard Day's Night's a good choice because everyone always picks, like, Abbey Road or the White Album, and it's nice to hear something from the early years.
Yeah, but you just said to me that a lot of people have been picking
Well, if they pick one from the early years, it's A Hard Day's Night, and that's not a bad choice.
So you think I picked okay? I'm kind of worried.
you picked
I'm
good.
kind of being generic here. I'm just picking what everybody
You're
else.
not being generic, John. It's a good record.
Okay,
If you were
I
generic,
believe
you'd pick Meet the Beatles, the American one.
really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Now it's my turn to be controversial.
Yeah. Wow. There you go.
And
Now, do you actually go by the Canadian albums when you think about? Because I always go by the British ones. Do you go by the Canadian ones?
I go by. I really consider the American and Canadian ones to an extent novelties. Like I go off of the British records because that's the way they were meant to be. Although they're nice cultural artifacts. Having
exactly.
So this is how Capitol decided to market it to Americans.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that you kind of go by the American, because the American, by the British ones. The British ones were on the CDs, weren't they? They were released in '87, and I believe a lot of Americans at that time were kind of shocked because they didn't realise that they were completely different albums, or a lot of them were.
Yeah. Imagine the guy who actually was disappointed when he bought the CD of A Hard Day's Night. It's like, why is there actual Beatle music on this? This should just be George Martin. Yeah,
exactly.
And lastly, do you have a least favorite Beatle record?
I mean, doesn't everybody go for Beatles for Sale or Let It Be?
I would be hurt if you said Beatles for Sale, but Let It Be is a
lot of people say that.
That's the kind. That's the unwritten thing of the show. It's for like best albums. I always say there's a correct answer for best album, and there's a correct answer for worst album, and you hit the nail on the head with the worst one.
Okay, I don't know if this is the worst. Okay, I'm not going to say that because I think that'd sound ridiculous if I said that. But the one that I think is just vastly overrated in terms of a listening experience, I don't mean in terms of how significant it was, is Sgt. Pepper.
I agree.
Yeah, some of the songs on that are so trite, I've got no interest in them, really.
If I want to hear psychedelic Beatles, I'll put on Magical Mystery Tour.
Oh, I think you're right.
Yeah, because it's...
I mean, you agree on that. I think you're about right on that.
Because they're doing, like, most of the stuff that they were kind of doing on Pepper, just a bit psychedelic and a little less trite. I mean, you still have, like, Your Mother Should Know. You still have Fool on the Hill. But... I think Your Mother Should Know is a great song. Oh, it is, but I
was going to pick that as one of my favourite songs, believe it or not.
Really?
Yes, I like it that much. But again, it's because I was playing it a lot when I was writing this book because I wanted to, like I say, I was trying to avoid yesterday.
Aren't we all?
Yeah. But, I think that's a great song. I do.
Some of the songs, like the songs I don't quite like on Magical Mystery Tour, I feel like are made better by the god-awful TV movie. Because I enjoy the song more when I see, the Beatles walking down the stairs and all that stuff.
Exactly. Isn't that the best part of the movie? Your Mother Should Know.
I don't know if it's the best part, but I can tell you what the worst part is.
There's so many. There's a lot of
part where John's shoveling spaghetti.
Yeah, I've got no time for that. Don't like that. But yeah, I mean, when they're coming down the steps and all that, Your Mother Should Know, I think it is a nice piece, which makes the song even better, I think, really.
Exactly. So. And now I turn it over to you. Where can people find you and your book?
Okay, the book is available on all online retailers, the ones I mean. If anybody wants a signed copy, obviously, because of lockdown, you can't really do that, but there's a bookstore in Chicago called The Book Cellar. Cellar as in wine cellar. They sell wine there as well. And I left a load of signed copies there, so you can get one from them if you want. Otherwise, as I say, on any online retailer. And if you want to, what I put on social media, it's not about me or my cat or anything like that. Don't worry. It's about the Beatles. So if you want to follow me on Instagram, where I put all the interviews, my Instagram account is johnlyons.beatles. Quite easy. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's John F. Lyons 2. And I don't know who John F. Lyons 1 is, but they took it.
Son of a bitch. He took it.
They're probably listening to this show now.
He's probably
anyway.
He's probably trying to steal your identity.
Well, that's what I'm worried about. I should never have picked that, should I? I should have gone for something else, but I was in a panic. You know what it's like when you've got decisions to make quickly. Anyway, and then Facebook, I got a Beatles page. Again, nothing about me in it, just the Beatles. And that's called John F. Lyons Beatles. So if you're interested on stuff that either never made it into the book or some portions of the book that are elongated, they're the places.
And I'll put all the links in the description, so if you don't feel like typing it out, you can just scroll down and click.
Well, thank you, Ethan.
Well, of course.
That's very nice of you.
You've taken the time to be with me today. That's the least I can
Well,
do.
you take the time to be with me.
And now this is my least favorite part of the show. I have to give my little spiel about where to find the show. Oh, God. It's always a tongue twister. If you're watching this on YouTube, which a lot of you seem to do, well, listening, not watching, please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And also, if you haven't already, ring that little bell notification icon so you get notified every time a new episode of the show gets uploaded. And I post other things, like recently I posted an interview with a host of the Old Grey Whistle Test, Bob Harris, which isn't really an episode of Fans on the Run, but you can listen to that there too. And the people who had the bell got to hear it first. So you're missing out. We're on all the podcasting platforms, all of them. Basically, anywhere you want to find a podcast, we will be there. So Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, blah, 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 blah. And all the sites with the word pod in the name. And we're on social media, Twitter, Fans on the Run Pod, Facebook, Fans on the Run Podcast, and Instagram, where I post all the cool art for the show, Fans on the Run Podcast. There we go. How did I do, John?
Wow, that was very impressive. I could never remember all that.
I barely... It took about 40 episodes to drill that into my head.
Wow. That's all 40 episodes?
Well, we're up to like some 60-something now, I think.
Yeah, I'm impressed. And Whispering Bob Harris. Am I following Whispering Bob Harris?
In what way?
The next episode?
Well, it's an episode that was posted previously. I did, in fact, get Whispering Bob.
Yes, he's part of my youth. I used to watch the Old Grey Whistle Test. And I don't know if you ever mentioned it to him, but I always felt bad about him when he got beaten up by the Sex Pistols.
I didn't mention that to him, but it was in my notes, and we're doing, I think, a third interview, so I'll bring that up for you.
I think it was actually just Sid Vicious. I can't remember if the rest were involved.
I think it was even before Sid Vicious was in the Sex Pistols. He's like, hey, are they going to be on the Old Grey Whistle Test? And he got, like, someone tried to attack him, and he was protected by aforementioned Procol Harum roadies.
Oh, was that who it was?
I think so.
Oh, okay.
So it's a bit of a full circle with this show today.
Yeah. Well, there. So we're going to end on Procol Harum.
I guess. I can't play the song because I would get sent to copyright jail or whatever. But just imagine you're listening to Whiter Shade of Pale.
Easily done.
There you go. John, thank you so much for being with me today.
Well, thank you, Ethan. It was a pleasure. And it was also a pleasure that I could speak to a Canadian who could understand this Chicago accent of mine.
Yes.
So thank you.
It's nice to speak with someone who spells color right, too. With the
Thank
U.
you. Do you say shot or jab?
I alternate.
Interesting.
Yeah. In terms of like a vaccine?
Yes.
Well, I'm getting my jab next week.
So you do say jab?
I'm saying jab right now.
Oh, just for me? Okay.
Well, I say jab other times too, but...
Oh, you
yeah.
do? Yeah.
But to everyone else out there, thank you for listening. You can go home now.
Fans on the Run is produced by Ethan Alexanian. Additional voiceovers by Richard Phillip. This has been a Showtown production.